I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to go very personal. Years ago, my mentor when I was in art school said to me, Maya, the more personal you make it, the more universal it becomes. And while I have a Master of Fine Arts degree in painting and illustration, I'm not much of an academic. And some of you are brilliant and you know history so well. I know history, I just can't remember it. So anyways, I was one of the lucky ones. I grew up in an artist family. Curious, can you tell which one of these might be my parents? They're all siblings and parents. Those are my aunt and uncle, my grandparents, and that's my mom and my dad. My parents were full-time artists. My dad was a teacher for 30 years in high school, and he owned art stores. And I worked in those art stores from the time I was 8 years old. I mean, I was cleaning, mostly. But by the time I was 12, they started to let me actually make stuff because I was digging into every stuff or breaking it. So they figured they'd let me make stuff. So I was selling jewelry, macrame. I was the self-proclaimed macrame queen by the time I was 12 years old. I mean, major like wall hangings and wire jewelry. My mom taught ceramics, my dad taught paintings. And my creative vision expanded with the square footage of my parents' art stores. I worked in those art stores till I was 19, and then I got the hell out. And I grew up in northern Michigan, and I was at an art school, or at an engineering school, because you know, I was studying architecture because that's what you do. You can't make a living at art, right? So I froze my butt off. They had 7 days straight of 70 below wind chill factor. And I went to the counselor's office after we could finally go outside, and I said, I'm out of here. Give me the top 5 art schools in California. And years later, I was working with one of my graduate students, and I was looking at the list of art schools in California and realized that he'd given me the top 5 art schools alphabetically. That's how naive he was about art. I was at an engineering school, and he sent a 19-year-old girl across country on her own on an alphabetical list. So my dad did this sign. He was a letterer, and that was like our very first sign for our very first art store. So I know this may be a little sacrilegious in a Mosaic forum, but my degrees are in painting. Okay, I'm a highly trained painter. I've been painting since I was 17, and this is my very first painting. My very first oil painting, not including the finger painting years, you know. So, and I realized recently that even back then, I was doing women with fabric. Although they're slaves in a sweatshop, I don't do that anymore, but that was my first oil painting. So now, for many, many years, and having been painting for 33 years, my work has evolved somewhat. And I'm going to show you some of my paintings because they really, really inform my mosaic work. This is the first in my most recent series called Svelata. Svelata means unveiled. It's like the Lei è stata svelata. She was unveiled. It's the veil of life. The illusion of life is always in my work. So the fabric always represents her connection to the material world, the illusion. And Maya actually means the illusion of life, the delusion of life in many cultures. So this is where this symbolism started to arrive into my work, was just I started doing a series called In Name Only about women who are named Maya, and that's where that came from. Now the water sleeps into my work as my connection to the divine. It's spirit, it's emotions, you know, it's the mystical aspect of life. So in all these paintings, I'm trying to bring those two together, you know, like we all are in our lives. I'm trying to integrate my physical world, my outer world with my inner world, you know, with God. And in some cases, you can see I'm not really making a great connection. Sometimes water seems to disappear, but the fabric becomes almost watery. Other times, like the water is seeping up along the outsides in reflections. These paintings are very, very personal. I mean, this is called Santita, which means sanctity. And they're very personal, autobiographical works of mine that they just tell my story at the time when I was working on it, as all of our work does. And I still paint. This is Serena. And I painted her in Italy. And I tend to name them with the language wherever I'm painting them. So a lot of these were painted in Italy. And I am the model for all of them. So I go into the water and I work with a photographer, and I practically drowned. And then this is called Shroud. And you can see I have a thing for fabric and water. This has a little delay on it. So I'm a painter. I'm working in my studio. I'm a full-time illustrator. And one day, this man walks into my studio in Newport Beach. I was in this great little place next to a cafe. And he'd been wandering around the neighborhood asking people if they knew of a mosaic artist who could do these mosaics for this school. This is the oldest elementary school on the West Coast. It's over 110 years old. And these things used to be piled up with Spanish mission tile, and he wanted to replace them with mosaics. I said, well, we don't know if she does mosaics, but she's a good painter, you should go talk to her. So he comes in my studio and starts telling me about this project. I said, well, I've always wanted to do a mosaic. And he says, well, there's 9 of them. I said, well, I haven't always wanted to do 9 of them. And I said, I've always wanted to do a mosaic, but to be honest with you, I don't know how to do them. He says, well, you think you can do it? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Because that's pretty much how I answer things. And my little sister, which is funny, she also has an MFA in illustration. She's sitting there, because we just had lunch, and she's just like going, oh my God. And Tara actually worked with me from day one. And so this project, took us 16 months to do. This is my very first mosaic. And there's only 22 colors in there. I didn't even know they were made out of glass, okay? I went to Home Depot, which is our big hardware store. I bought a tile saw. I bought porcelain floor tiles. Has anyone worked with porcelain before? Oh my God, we're like on the floor trying to cut these things out. No way. It cannot be done like this. I can't do this. So then I started just looking online, and I found, Venetian, the little tiles, and the 1-inch ones, which is, this whole thing is entirely out of those, and there's basically 22 colors. So over time, from the first one to the third one, I had discovered Murano and Bizzaza and Smalti. Now I'm working in the indirect method. Everything's face down, because I got all these different materials. I didn't even know that you could have texture in mosaics. Every mosaic that I'd ever seen was high Renaissance. I love high Renaissance glass mosaics. They're smooth, Never occurred to me to use texture. I thought, well, how do you do it smooth? You do it face down. I bought 2 books. That's how I taught myself how to do mosaics. I never took a workshop. I didn't know anyone who did mosaics. All my friends were, fine art painters, I know a lot of mosaicists now, but I didn't know any. I didn't even know to ask. I didn't know there was a world out there of people who actually did this. This was 16 years ago. So this is the third one, and it's already starting to take a lot of dimension. So I finished that project, and literally less than 2 years later, a woman walks into my studio. I'm doing mosaics. I've done a number of them, not that many between this. And she says, oh my God, I have the greatest commission for you in about a year from now. And she left. And 8 months later, she comes to my studio, and she was freaking out. She's an interior designer. Well, she ran home and told her client that day that she found this mosaic artist. And that day, 8 months later, he says, so when am I going to see this mosaic? Is it done yet? This is 6.5 feet by 26 feet long, which would make it 3.25 meters by, 8 meters? More than 8 meters long. It's 4,000 hours of work. Can you see it okay? This is laying out all the sections. Make sure it was 24 sections, 12 across the top, 12 across the bottom. It's at a client's residential home by their pool. It floats off the wall. It's wrapped with cove lighting, so it looks like it has a halo, and it's got 16 pin lights. My client is in the entertainment industry, so lighting is everything to him, which is good for me, because I'm very happy with that. But it's dimensional. I basically just walked up and down the beach for 11 different nights, over 11 sunsets. I threw all my images into Photoshop and started just playing with them, just trying to come up with like a day in the life of Newport Beach, something very ethereal, something that was contemporary, because my clients had very, very strong contemporary art collection. And something that also opened up this space and created a, because all they saw is ocean here and then like wall there. So they see ocean and now you see mosaic. And it works like a big window. It's really quite beautiful. And I just had a workshop and did a tour. And in order to bring my group over to his house, I had to clean it, maybe clean it. So it had a lot of salt because it's right on the beach. But it's in Photoshop, I just designed it to create like these layering, it's like something that you couldn't, not really solid, something very ethereal that you had a sense of, and all the different qualities of light, just spending over the different days and the evenings on the beach. So this is actually technically the biggest mosaic I've ever done. Now, I do a lot of public works projects in Laguna Beach. This is an Art for Public Spaces piece. I'm still working in the indirect method. All of these are face down, can't see anything, glue it down, pick it up, glue it down, pick it up. For those of you, how many of you work in the indirect method? So you get it. I had actually discovered a little stained glass. I was buying them in those little strips and pre-cut things at this time. I found them online. So I was using a little bit in here and in the water areas to create some, so I'm starting to like get these little transparencies and that in my work. And then still face down though, same thing with this piece. This is a big piece. It's 2 meters by 2.5 meters on the side of a restaurant. It's a restaurant that had Portuguese food, so it's a Portuguese explorer ship. And I've actually worked with like the preeminent tall ship designer in the world. My neighbor just happened to know him personally and called him up on the phone, and he critiqued my drawings for Mosaic. So, but it's actually technically pretty accurate. And we did this in 5 weeks. I had to save them. Because it's an Art for Public Spaces piece, it means that they can't actually open until they have their public art up. And they had another artist, and the Arts Commission turned it down. So 7 weeks before their opening, they came to me, and I took on the job. I went to the Arts Commission, and I said, can I even get in? They got me on the docket. I got a unanimous approval of the design, and we had 5 weeks left to do it. And we basically saved their butt. I had my little sister working for me and 2 other student interns. And I got free food from that restaurant for 5-6 years after that. It was great. And still, to this day, if I show up, I'll get like a bottle of wine or something. And, but it's fun. This piece here, remember the school, the 9 on the school? Well, 10 years later, I'm about 8 or 10 years later, they commissioned me to do a 10th piece for the same school. So now, when you go to this school, and this is my first piece in the direct, it's not really direct, it's like double direct. I don't even know what to call my technique. But when I was working on this one, and I had this girl working for me, Marilyn, and she says, how come you never work with stained glass? I'm like, what do you mean stained glass? Where do you get stained glass? I mean, it never occurred to me that people that make stained glass windows actually have to buy stained glass. I'm like, and she goes, oh, there's a big warehouse about 15 minutes from here. Turns out I live 15 minutes away from Hollander Glass's largest warehouse in the world, largest stained glass distributor in the world. 15 minutes, and she took me over there, and I walked in, and it was like, oh, it was like the clouds parted, and oh my God, I switched. That day, I went face up, all stained glass, all the smalty, everything else got stored away, because now I could see what I was doing, because they're basically all the same thickness. So that's when I switched, and this is my first one in all stained glass. So you have this one by the front door, and then you have my very first one at the other end by the auditorium. So that one school is like the history of my Tavonatti mosaics. And it's quite funny, because everybody thinks someone else did this. Yeah. Oh, and funny story, this piece, oops, how do I go back? This is how people get, I didn't even think of it, but somebody wanted me to rip out that whole title because it's an elementary school, and The Departed, which won the Academy Award that year, or one of those years, has violence in it, and they didn't think it should be on there. I never saw the movie, So I photographed the theater, and that's what was playing at the time. And then after the thing was installed, they had like a whole committee trying to get me to rip that out. Can you imagine? I mean, it's like 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, and they're really tight. I don't know if any of you are familiar with how tight my work is, but I'd have to take a sledgehammer to it. So now I'm working face up. I can see what I do. Remember, I used to paint. I paint figures. I'm a figurative painter. But I couldn't do that face down. I did do one mermaid face down, and when I peeled off the paper, it was not quite what I expected. So now I can do figures, and I can develop the depth of the piece and bring in a lot of the things that I do as a painter. Remember, it never even occurred to me to do anything else but to be a natural transition. It's just another medium for me. So my voice is the same, whether I'm working with paint or working with glass or working with stones, and I do all of that. And as an art student, many of you know, you work with everything. I mean, you're doing woodblock, you're doing sculpture, you're doing, watercolor one day, and all kinds of stuff. So Metamorphosis is my first woman under the surface. And again, the water and the fabric, for me, they're not just mermaids. I know that's what she is physically, but they're all symbols of metamorphosis. She's always trying to become like that fish, because that fish is symbolic of the perfect integration. That fish lives in that water. Remember, the water is the soul. The water is the spirit. It's emotions. It's her inner life, and she's trying. It's like, is she either trying to be more like the fish, or is the fish trying to be more like her? And so she's dragging her veil around. That's the fabric, and the veil is always taking on the color of the fish. So this is my second or third one, actually, and this is for a house in Hawaii. I have these fabulous clients that have 3 houses on Oahu, and they like my work, so I get to go to Hawaii a lot. And they're always changing their mind, so they always have to send me back to do one little thing that they were too cheap to have me do in the first place, even though they're very, very well, like that outlet right there. I got flown back to Hawaii to take that outlet out, because as soon as she saw that, she's like, oh no, I can't have that. But she didn't want to take them all out in the first place. But this actually goes all the way around, and it goes all the way around the rest of the kitchen like this. So it's quite large. And that right there is 1.5 meters by 2.5 meters, just that cooktop. And somebody said to me, they go, that is probably the only thing that could make me want to cook. So I agree with you. This is a little more detail. Had some fun cutting, scallop shapes. But I love the water. I can't seem to get out of the water. This was for a house very close to my home, and it's three members that own they all invested in this together. It's 3 siblings, and they wanted it was like $10,000 more, bigger. They wanted it bigger. I said, well, that's going to cost you about 10 grand more. And he says, well, would you consider working trade? And I said, well, what do you got to trade? And he says, we got beach houses. So I traded 10 square feet, the extra 10, for 10 weeks at their beach house. So if any of you saw me on Facebook at the beach house last week, that's where I was. It's the best fee I've ever been paid, because, really, you'd have to pay like $5,000-6,000 a week for this place, and I love it. And I'm almost out of weeks. I have 3 more weeks left, but they want another Mosaic. So I keep putting them off, because I'm like, I'm gonna trade more. Yeah. And then this is called Svelata. She's number 17 in my series of paintings, but she's the first one in glass. And I did her specifically for ArtPrize. ArtPrize is the world's largest art competition, which I entered in 2010. This is 2.5 meters by 13 feet long, which is 4 meters? A little more than 4 meters. It's big, and we did it in 11 weeks. It's 2,500 hours of work. I had one intern who all she did was cut bubbles. They're all hand cut. There are thousands of them. She would come in. She wouldn't even sit at the table with me. She'd just sit on the floor and just cut bubbles all day long. And then we cut them and put them together. And I worked with my sister all these years. She's fabulous. And we work in a hierarchy, like I do all the really hard stuff and I design everything, and we're right there. We're all sitting together working on sections, and it's a blast. I love it. And then, the less skill they get, the simpler tasks like cutting bubbles, which is how I train everybody. I train everyone on cutting bubbles. And when I have clients in, I have them cut bubbles because they're really hard to cut right in the beginning, and it makes them realize how much work goes into this. So then they really appreciate how much money I'm charging them. I do, and almost all of my commissions have bubbles done by my clients. So they'll do one, and it may take them all day to do it, but they get to put their one piece in there, and it's funny. So this is at ArtPrize, and this little girl, she's like my biggest fan. And she was just, there were like 30 kids one night, and they were just like, you could see they're jonesing to just touch this thing. I'm like, you guys want to touch it? And I actually have a photograph of like 15 or 20 kids just with their hands on it, just going like this. It was just really beautiful. But she's quite special. She comes up to me and she says, "Where's Bocce?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She's 4 years old. "Bocce? How do you know Bocce?" Bocce's my cat. And she goes, "I saw her on Facebook." Her mother is a big fan of mine, and she totally teaches these kids about art, set up a little studio, and I sent them a bunch of stuff and books I've done. And they've just grown into these fabulous, her and her brother, into these fabulous little artists. They're so good, cool. So this is a little closer up. Her head it's big. And I worked on it. That's where I started, and I kept ripping it out because I'm using some translucence, and the light kept changing, and I kept thinking I was screwing it up, so I keep changing it. Finally, I walked away from it, and I came back to it 11 weeks later and looked at it and go, "Oh, it's right." So I took second at ArtPrize that year, and then I sold that piece to a private collector. But the next year, I was working on this crucifixion for St. Kilian's Catholic Church in California. And I got a call from Father Bruce. He says, the church wasn't built yet. He says, but I had started it earlier because I didn't have anything else to do, and they're good for it. It's, the diocese. And he says, well, we can't pay you for a number of months. So I said, well, you know what, I'll finish it. I've been working on it for a couple of months with, my sister and Nadia. But I'm going to enter an ArtPrize, and if I win, they keep it, and then I'll have to do another one for you. And he goes, okay, we'll just call it practice then. So I won ArtPrize in 2011 with the Crucifixion of Christ, and it became, and it's a People's Choice Award too. You have to actually go and register there they have 400,000 votes you get put in, and it's amazing. Any one of you can. There's a lot of mosaic artists in it. I see them all the time, but it's quite intense. And then when I came back, I did another one. So I have two of those. And obviously they're not the same, but it's the same composition. So if you've seen pictures of the one in the church, that's the second one. And I got better because the first one was practice. So I fixed all those things. But I like these kind of photos. I like to show what I call glass effects. And you can see the painter in me. I've really started, on Sfilata and the Crucifixion, I really started to embrace the glass because I had very little time and I had to figure out how to use stained glass, faster, and I was chopping up all these gorgeous sections. And so on Sfilata, I started to really, in the water, I started to really use the glass. I'd cut it into mosaics, but I ended up putting sections back down and integrating with bubbles and that, but leaving it the way it was. And you see a lot of that. Now I hunt for sections. And my design constantly changes as I'm working based on the glass. I'm always responding to the glass, always. So, if I have a figure in water, I have my original design, but it ends up being completely different based on what glass I can find. And I love that piece. Ooh, I got to use that, So that's how I work now. And I'm always trying to create that more painterly method. And I know someone says, it's not a painting. I'm like, well, yeah, but you know what? That's my work, and I'm a painter and a mosaic artist. They're all the same to me. So to me, my standards, the things I learn, I apply them to all my mediums, no matter what I'm using. This was done for the largest donor of that church. that a couple donated a lot of money, so they had me do a crown of thorns. It's only 18 by 18 inches, and it took me 130 hours to do, to give to them as a gift. So he's like my third one. And then a Facebook fan saw that other one, and she bought a reproduction, and she says, I want the female aspect of God. So she had me do glory. I designed glory to be, she had one of each size. And this one took me 230 hours to do because I had just had brain surgery and I was just getting my vision back and my hands were shaking and I was wearing glasses. And most of the time I was just sitting there going, like that, and just calming down and trying to be, a lot of it was just trying to get back into it. It's very emotional. And she kept calling me. She goes, are you okay? Are you not happy with the work? I didn't want to tell her what I was going through. And she was worried that it was the piece and that I didn't want to do the piece. I'm like, no, this is going the way I want it. It's just going really slow because it's really small pieces. So now she's called Queen of the Angels. And she's inspired by the queen angelfish. So another one of my figures in water, another metamorphosis piece. And pushing the glass more and more. Same method. She's only like 1 meter by 1 meter. And then Bat-Yam. Bat-Yam means daughter of the sea. And I was in Israel teaching a workshop. I was working on this and I was putting out on Facebook, what should I name her? Because the name has to come to me. And we were having a conversation with Sibel, Hananel, and some other people. And someone says, you should call her something mermaid. And I said, I don't want to call her mermaid. And she goes, no, it means daughter of the sea. And to me, that was perfect. So this was a commission, but she's inspired by the betta fish. So she has a betta tail. And
do you adhere onto acrylic so that it gives that translucency?
do I what?
Do you glue onto acrylic?
No. I work, it's all glass. And it's just on a white background. But I use everything from full transparent to full opaque now. So the white background bounces out, but I do play a lot with transparencies in the glass now. And a lot of the bubbles are like 100% transparent, and they cast their own shadows and everything. It's really cool. So you can see like these little ones that really bling out, those are these clear glass almost, and they grab the light. So when you see the original, it has a lot of depth and a lot of variation in it. All right, so I just want to show you the last ones. These are just details of more of the same thing. But in Italy recently with that gentleman right there, sorry, I was inspired to do a sculptural mosaic, which I'd never done before. I had never done a frame, nothing, not a glass, no anything. And I had to do a chair. And I wanted to marry my fabric and my painting with my mosaic. And I figured out, I worked with an artist how to use fiberglass mesh fabric dipped in resin. And I did it on this chair. It worked great. That's my drapery. And that's my water. So I've brought those two elements back into my work in a sculptural form. And Giulio Manassi did my signature for me. And there's resin dripped on here and everything, but there's shells and there's stones that I brought from California. And I think I stole a couple stones from someone else there. But a lot of smalty, brought the smalty back out, and stained glass. These are like edges. And then I just finished this one, and this is the last slide. Or not the last slide, but the last piece. I just did this for Gaziantep, Turkey. This is a wall piece, but it's on the same kind of fiberglass mesh structure. This is very transparent, so it has this very amorphic, primordial feel to it. And you can see mosaic through different parts of it. And I'm having a lot of fun. And I love the textures, but I love the realism too. It's for me, it's like I've been a sculptor for 25 years too, so it's bringing all that back together, the painting, the mosaic, sculpture. For me, it's really bringing it all together. and I learned a lot in that studio. We were working with Julio, 11 artists, and from all different countries, and I was just going, like method overload. So I'm really having fun. And this is Bocce. And this is what Bocce does when she says, I'm done. She comes, she sits right in front of me, and she stares at me like, you're done. So I'm done, thank you, and glad to be here.